My name is Lauren Cook. I am your Dean of College and Gap Year Advising. I am very excited to welcome you this evening for our junior college kickoff. A couple of housekeeping items up top. Everyone is on mute currently, and I would ask you to stay that way for now. We're going to have some presentation for about 20 minutes up top here, and then get into some testing conversation and then some Q&A. So when we are taking questions, we'll utilize the chat box for that, but it would be really helpful as I'm managing slides and all the rest to just sit back and listen for now, make a note of your questions, and we will absolutely get to them. I expect this meeting to run just about an hour, so we will end at 8 p.m. And know that it's being recorded for those who are unable to attend, and so you can watch this back if there's something you missed, or if you do have to step away, know that we will be pushing this out hopefully by the end of the week. And then, as I mentioned about half an hour ago, I did send out a copy of the PowerPoint that I'm using with some of those notes column on it. So if you do want to take notes, feel free to do so. You, of course, don't have to use it, but I thought it might be helpful for some folks. So this is the official launch of the college search process for the class of 2022. Typically, we'd be doing this in the JCHS theater. I am sad that we are not able to be in person right now, but hopefully this will be a good close second. We're all used to Zoom at this point. And this is an exciting time. You know, it's a time where students can really start to dream big about what happens after high school and think about all of the options, and you have a lot of options to choose from. And I know there may be some students that are thinking like, Ms. Cook, I'm not ready to go to college yet. And that's okay, because you're not going yet. We are starting a long-term process here tonight that will happen for the next year and a half. And so, you know, you can think of it like a marathon where we're going to have, you know, certain markers of our progress along the way. If you're a gamer, you can think of it like a game where we're going to go through a couple of different worlds and stages, you know, on a quest to our final goal, which is, of course, having a plan post high school. And everyone's marathon project game is going to look different, right? Because you are all unique, different human beings, and your goals and dreams are going to be different from one another. And I certainly hope that we will have, you know, a strong and supportive college advising community as you go through this process together over the next year and a half. But I also hope that you will keep it grounded in what you need and want, and not necessarily what your friends are doing or what the media says that you should value around your college search. This is your one and unique life. And so this is a moment where you can really start taking the steering wheel with it. Know that you're not doing this alone. Of course, you've got a team behind you. You are the captain of the team, student, and I'm really your coach, helping you to go through this process. But your parents will likely be team members as well, as you want to share writing with them or go on visits together. There are faculty that will be members of your team that may draft recommendation letters for you and give you some advice through this process. You may have some select friends that you want to have on your team as well, and ask them about writing or practice interviewing or whatnot. And our goals over the next year and a half as a team are going to be to reflect on yourself and your time in high school, and really do some deep thinking about what's worked for you and what hasn't, and how we can kind of pivot as we look to your time post JCHS for your next educational home. Find some options that fit that vision for yourself, right? And I hope that you'll heed my advice and guidance on sort of navigating the best way towards those options. And I do want to just pull over here for a moment and remind us that while the vast majority of JCHS students are headed to a four-year college after they graduate, that's not the only option. And we do have students that are going to two-year colleges, that may choose to enlist in the IDF, that may access a gap year along with any of those other options. And I'm here to help you with all of those things, but we are, of course, going to focus on the four-year college process this evening because it can be the most complicated of all of those various paths. So once we've thought about those options that are a good fit for you in the spring of your senior year, our goal is, of course, to have a couple of really solid choices for you, and you can decide on the best one for yourself and that match those goals that you made for your life post JCHS. So that's the big picture. We're going to take this in bite-sized chunks, right? It's too much to think about the whole year and a half and all of the moving parts. So we're going to just start with the first steps this evening as we go on this quest together and lay the groundwork for the early stages of your search. So I'm going to talk for another 15 minutes or so about some of those first steps. And then I'm going to pull in Bruce Reed, who is in the room watching, who will help us zero in on the testing portion of that groundwork. And he is the co-founder and executive director of Compass Education Group, who are great partners with JCHS in helping us with all things testing. And then we'll wrap up with some brief summaries and reminders and do some Q&A as well with you if there's anything left over that we didn't cover. So let's start with step one of the process. And you might think that step one is really sort of jumping in on colleges, but it's about who am I? It's jumping in on you first. There are 4,000 some colleges and universities in the country, and we can't begin to winnow down those choices until we have some understanding about who you are and what it is that you're looking for. So I want to introduce you to the 5 I's as a way to get started in terms of thinking about investigating who you are and what might be important as we start to think about the right college for you. So your identity, how do others see you, how do you see yourself, and what might we be looking for in a college community that's going to support that identity? Intellectually, in what environment do you learn best? What ideas are important to you, the values and things that you hold, and how you might want to see those reflected in others in your college community. Your interests, how do you spend your free time? Are you going to be able to find those things on college campuses? And then thinking about inspiration and the kinds of things that motivate you, the people that you admire, and how that might impact the type of institutions that we're looking at as well. So these all come from a book called The College Conversation. This actually just came out this fall. It's really a step-by-step guide going through your college process. It's more geared towards parents as an audience. So for those of you that are interested in going deeper into the college search, I would recommend this. It's a little buttoned up in its tone, but they do have some great prompts like these 5 I's to really help you start thinking about how to come up with what your list of values and goals are as you're looking at specific colleges. So in practical terms, I would say that you need to brainstorm some of these answers to these 5 I questions. And this could be, a Google Doc that you've started. This could be a journal that you're keeping around your college search process. And you don't have to have schools or majors or any of those things in mind as you're thinking about answers to those questions. It's really just about a list of attributes that we can use to assess colleges as you learn more about them, right? Another piece of figuring out sort of who you are will be around your college advising questionnaire. So we'll talk more about this in a few minutes, but know that tomorrow there will be questionnaires in everyone's email inboxes. Both students and parents and guardians will receive questionnaires. And these are a place to share some of your preliminary thoughts about college to help me get to know you, but also to prompt you to think about some of these kinds of questions as well. And then I know I mentioned this a few months ago as we got started with SCORE, but the U Science games that are in SCORE are another great way to kind of think and reflect on yourself. It takes about 2 hours to do the whole set of games, so it's something that maybe students want to spend a little time during winter break on. I know that there are a handful of members of the class who've completed this already. Awesome. If you haven't, you're not behind, that's fine. But these can be really useful to kind of show you how your brain works and talk about a couple of careers that might be a good match with the way that your thought process works, can help you drill down to majors that lead to those careers and colleges that are really strong in those majors. So it all sort of is linked together there. I did U Science back during Passover break in April for myself. You get a 30-page report you can print out if you'd like. It also gives you a lot of things just technologically online, but it basically told me I would make a great college counselor. So I do think that, it's somehow got some science behind it to really get at the things that you can do well based on your brain and your personality. So that is step one, how to really start thinking about yourself and who am I and what am I looking for? Gosh, my computer is really giving me trouble with the slides. So then step two, we're going to try and figure out what the right college fit looks like and understand that our mission is really about fit. This is not really about associating yourself with brand names, which I know can be sometimes an approach to the college search, but it's not about following your best friend. It's not about following your, boyfriend or girlfriend off to college. This is about you and the right fit for you. This is where you're going to spend 4 years of your life going to class and eating the food and all the rest. So we really want to overlay those who am I questions with what individual institutions have to offer and figure out your best fit. So what are we talking about when we're talking about fit? Well, there's really kind of 4 factors here, and these are pretty obvious, right? Academically, does the college offer what you're kind of thinking about? Are you a STEM person? Are you thinking about film? Finding the places that offer strong programs and things that you think you might be interested in. Socially, is it going to have the right kind of extracurricular opportunities for you, the right kind of cultural vibe for you? And of course, financially, can you afford to go there? That's a very real question, especially now during a pandemic and folks feel some financial pressures and things are changing. And then of course, admission-wise, can you get in? Is this a place where you're actually admissible? So the first 2 questions here with fit are a little more clear and straightforward, and there's a lot of resources that I'll talk about in just a moment to discern those. The second 2 are a little less clear, right? And a little harder to predict. So that's where I will certainly be providing some assistance. So how do you figure out some of these things? Well, you're going to want to do some research, right? So in terms of finding out some of those academic and extracurricular things, these are 3 places I think you can get started. SCORE, obviously, our college search software, has a lot of great search functions on it. You can follow schools, you can filter on a number of different things. Big Future, which is another website, it's offered by the College Board, the folks that do the SAT and the PSAT, has an even more robust search function and a lot of different filters you can use. So those are 2 websites that I would definitely recommend. And then there is a physical book for those of us that still read books. This is the FIS Guide to Colleges. It is huge. It's like an old school phone book in its size, but it profiles some 350 colleges in very even-handed ways. These are not written by the colleges. This is not the shiny PR talk that you're going to hear from schools. It's more of a third-party assessment of socially and culturally and academically what the vibe is like on a campus. And they're only 2-page descriptions per school. I know it looks large, but it's a short amount of reading for your actual purposes. But it can really give you a good and accurate sense of a college campus and whether it might be a fit for you in terms of wanting to dive in a little bit deeper. So if you don't own a copy of the FIS Guide, I have a bunch of them trapped in my office at school that I would typically be able to loan out. But you might want to invest in one. I think it's like a $20 book on Amazon or your local independent bookseller, and can be really worth it, especially if you have several kids that are going to be headed off to college. So these are some of the research places to start. You're also going to want to review suggestions that I will make. So when we have our initial college advising meetings, which will start next week, after I've seen your questionnaire and we've had some conversations and all the rest, I'm going to recommend probably 15 or 20 schools for you. Put them in your SCORE account for you to review at your leisure, but there will be reasons why they're places that I am suggesting for you. And so I'll want you to at least give them a cursory look, even if every single one does not end up making the application list in the end. And then you're going to want to attend some virtual campus visits, some virtual information sessions as we go into the winter and the spring, and just continue to get information about different schools. And there are places that are going to kind of come on and off your radar and on and off your list. And that's perfectly natural for the beginning part of this process. Okay, so let's return to those factors of fit for a moment, because of course these last 2, as I said, are a little bit more tricky to answer. Can I pay for it and can I get in? And I want to be clear before we get into the whole selective college admission conversation, which is of course where I'm headed, that the average acceptance rate for all the colleges and universities in the US is 68%. So know that the majority of US colleges admit the majority of students that apply to them, okay? There are 50 to 100 some schools that have these teeny tiny acceptance rates. And of course, we are all very focused on those schools because we're human, right? If a place says it might not want us, then we're even more intrigued. So know that for the vast majority of you, you're going to be applying to a lot of places that want you and are going to admit you. And it doesn't have to be a highly stressful situation. But for those that are much more competitive for admission, it's important to review some of the factors in college admission to help you understand your chances of acceptance. So what is in a college application? Those of you who went to the testing session we had earlier in the fall have seen this slide before. This is what is typically in a college application. And this is kind of the most exhausted list. This is what you'll see with a lot of private colleges, for example. Public institutions, the UCs, they don't ask for all of these things. But this is kind of the laundry list. And I help support students with all of these things. So helping to craft essays and making a testing plan and deciding who you might want to approach to draft your recommendation letters and all the rest. I do want to pause on this very last bullet point, expression of interest, to just make sure that we are all clear on that. In some of my emails from the fall about attending college visits to JCHS, we talked about something called demonstrated interest and why it would be important to go to some of those visits because you will get a check mark with demonstrated interest. So there are a lot of colleges that are really interested in and sort of follow the theory that the more engagement a student has had with the college, the more likely they are to enroll. So when colleges, some of them, are thinking about making an admission decision on you, they will check to see, well, has a student engaged with us and in what kinds of ways? And so attending a college visit to JCHS, going to do a virtual visit online where you've had to note your name and address and all of that, going on an actual physical campus visit, should we be able to do that at some point, all of those sort of tick boxes off of expressing interest in that institution. So again, not everybody engages in this. The UCs, for example, are not concerned about demonstrated interest, but there are a lot of places that are. So it's a factor that's on the list. Okay, so these are all things that you have some control over, right? I mean, you are earning your grades, you are taking the tests, you are writing your essays, you are conducting your interviews yourself. You can manage these and how they turn out to some degree. There are some students that talk about the admission process being random, right? And that it is just like a lottery and they don't really understand how decisions are made. I do want to emphasize that the process is not random. My colleagues at admission offices go through very sort of scientific and data-driven processes to make admission decisions. When students talk about it being random, it's usually because they think these are the only factors for college admission, but there are another set of factors that you have to consider that are often called institutional priorities or hooks. So what do these things look like? Let me go to that slide. Some of these are going to look familiar to you. We heard about some of them with the Varsity Blues scandal. So if you are a really strong athlete, recruited athletes are definitely students that have some priority in the process. If you have a sibling that attends that institution or your parent went there, you are what's called a legacy student. So legacy students get some preference in the process. Being a VIP candidate, so this could of course mean being a famous person, but also, if your parents are big donors to the college, can buy a building, these are VIP folks that receive some preference. Non-white students, the highly selective institutions in this country are still overwhelmingly white. And so if you are bringing something else to the table, colleges are going to be interested in that. In the same way as first generation students to college, this means students whose both parents did not attend a four-year institution. More and more colleges are being asked to produce data about the number of first generation students they're educating, so that can actually give you some preference in the process as well. And then this last category is sort of the catch-all. Schools will just have their own specific priorities that can change year to year depending on what they need. So, for those institutions that want to have all 50 states represented, if they're missing North Dakota, you're going to receive some preference if you're applying from North Dakota. If they need a tuba player, if they've got a new data science department that they want to have majors to fill, these are all sorts of school-specific priorities. And most colleges don't make these things a secret. Like, you can ask admission reps, are there particular types of students that you're looking for this year? And usually, they'll give you a pretty honest answer. But you do have to understand this as a category that impacts admission. And it's something that I will talk individually with each student about in terms of understanding if you've got hooks or priorities with particular institutions and what that might mean for your admission. And if you don't, what that might mean for your admission. So these help us know a little bit if you can get in. It can also impact a little bit if you can pay for it, because there can be some, scholarship money or merit money attached to some of these things. And to be continued to talk about that category. All right, so I'm going to just return to the first steps here for a moment and get into the specifics of what's going to happen in the next couple of weeks. So as I mentioned, I'm going to ask you to complete these questionnaires. The hard deadline for them will not be until after winter break. So if you're a student who's having a particularly busy Q2, if you've got some demanding classes right now, and this is not something you feel like you can do in the next 2 or 3 weeks before break, that's okay. But I will ask to have them completed by everybody in the class by about the first week of January. If, on the other hand, you're really eager to get started with the college process, this is going to be in your inbox tomorrow. And so you can go ahead and fill it out the next few days. And they are required for students to do. It's optional for parents and guardians. I would love to have your voice in the process, but I know that we are all busy people, especially during these COVID times. Know for students that you cannot sign up for your first college advising meeting with me until you've completed this questionnaire. The questionnaire is going to ask you about your experience at JCHS, about subjects that you like. It's all about you. So hopefully it is kind of fun to fill out. And it's important to fill out carefully because this is my introduction to you if we haven't had a lot of chance to get to know each other until now. It's also the start of your college counselor recommendation letter. And I do write a recommendation letter for all 47 of you. So if I ask a question and you give me a 1-sentence answer, I'm not going to write a 1-sentence recommendation letter, but it's going to be harder for me to fill out a whole page, right? So with each question, it would be great if you can be as thorough as possible and really give me something to work with. Parents, your questionnaire is, more about what should I know about your child? Do you have particular aspirations for them? Are there colleges that are important to your family? Anything else sort of contextually I should know? It's a great time for you to give me your perspective on your child and what you think would be a really good fit for them. So after I get a questionnaire from a student, I will then send you a sign-up sheet to sign up for an advising appointment. These can be during study halls, lunch, after school, office hours. I've got a variety of times for you to choose from. It's just going to be the student and I for this first one. And then after this, I'm happy to meet with the whole family or just the parents or some combination of both. But I want to just start out getting to know the student. And we're going to do these all throughout December and January. So these will, have appointment times through the end of January, especially if, again, you're having a stressful Q2. We can wait and do this in the new year. And during these conversations, we're going to talk about your general thoughts for yourself, if you got some, and it's okay if you don't, about what you want to do post JCHS. We'll navigate through SCORE a little bit more to make sure you're comfortable with it and feel like you know how to kind of get around and look for what you need. We will talk about your recent practice test results. So that was like the #1 question on the RSVP form is when do we decide ACT versus SAT? I'm going to send a little bit more information out about that by the end of this week about making some decisions, but we'll talk about it during your advising meeting. And if you want to get started before that meeting, we can certainly do some things over email as well. And then after that meeting, usually same day, I will put those 15 to 20 some suggested schools into score for you to start looking at. And then, it's all about you doing some research and looking into those schools, and that will take us into really kind of the late winter and early spring. All right. So we're going to pause there on kind of the big picture and drill down more specifically now on that testing piece of the application, as it is kind of the most changing and fluid piece of the process currently. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen here and see, oh, look at all of you. I've been talking, it's just my little green light, but it's so good to see all of you. And I'm gonna bring in Bruce Reed here, who is, as I mentioned, the co-founder and executive director of Compass Education Group. They are a tutoring company. They provide one-on-one test prep, including for many of our families who, have raved about their services. And they're recognized as, and Bruce specifically is recognized as one of the nation's leading experts on standardized testing research and higher education trends. I feel like I have him on speed dial, especially this year as we're in these crazy COVID times. So Bruce, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Yeah, so hopefully folks watched one of the sort of general overview webinars from Compass that take you through each of the tests. And I know that, there's some other general information on the Compass website that I will be able to send out to you guys later in the week. Bruce is going to curate some links for me. So what we thought we'd do tonight is really just ask him a couple of the most pressing questions in this moment as things keep changing with COVID. So the first question, Bruce, that I got a lot of was, should juniors still plan to take a test? Like, what's the deal with, is testing still a thing?
Yeah.
In admission.
Testing is still a thing. A lot has changed this year, but a lot has stayed the same. And I think it's important to kind of balance that dialectic as you start to individualize your search process. As you said earlier, Lauren, it's easy for us to kind of talk about colleges in the abstract as though 4,000 schools all do the same thing and act in concert with one another, which of course they do not. And nobody applies to 4,000 schools. So you really need to start becoming very situational about the decisions you make and very individualized about the ways in which you are parsing test optional policies, how you are interpreting them. So if we went back a full year to, let's say, the fall of 2019, before COVID was on anybody's radar, there may have been 10 or 15% of those four-year schools that had some sort of test optional or test flexible policy. By the middle of the spring, we were up to about 95%. So it's very easy to look at the four-year college landscape and say it's essentially test optional, or in some cases test free, like here in California with the UCs and CSUs. However, how should we respond to those policies? Well, test free is pretty unambiguous. Test free is the most extreme version of deprioritizing, de-emphasizing the role of testing, and it's taking testing out of the mix. And we can talk a little bit more about UC and in-state policies in particular. But the other schools that are not test-free, that are test optional, I think you have to look at them at least in three broad categories. The ones that have gone permanently test optional, the ones that have gone test optional for multi-year, so they've already committed to a 2 or 3 year policy, and then those that went 1 year. And then you need to go even deeper into their language that describes their very carefully worded statement on their test optional policy. And you'll find a range of attitudes and a range of implied enthusiasm or reluctance or ambivalence around why they went test optional. For example, some schools were already leaning that way philosophically, and COVID was kind of the final impetus to say, we were already thinking about doing this. A lot of our peer institutions have gone test optional. Let's just do it already, and let's just go test optional. And they are very clear in their language that this was a philosophical move and that they can very confidently evaluate an application and an applicant with or without test scores. And it's really up to you to decide as a discretionary move whether you'll submit scores or not. The other end of that spectrum would be a school like University of Michigan comes to mind as one example. They are test optional, but in their language, they sort of state that they assume that if you have a test score, you would send it. So in other words, they're really saying, we understand that this is an extraordinary public health event. We don't expect this to last forever. If you were so impacted by this public health pandemic that you were unable to submit test scores, we understand. Otherwise, we expect to see test scores. So you really have to be careful about how you're interpreting test optional. What I wouldn't do is buy into this false narrative that test optional unilaterally means good test scores are no longer valuable, or test scores are entirely unnecessary. I would instead start reimagining what test scores can do for you as a strengthening tool, as a value add. And I would look at them the same way you look at your other strengths and your other optional components. A summer job is not required to apply to college. Extracurricular activities are not required. If you won a special award, you're not required to tell the college about that, but why wouldn't you, right? So you choose to include certain things in your story to strengthen that story. And if test scores can strengthen that story, I would include them. But what I would not do is just sort of cut testing off now. It's just premature to do that. And I would look at test optional as an option that I want to retain until the very end and decide a year from now with scores in hand whether I'll submit them and to whom. And it may be that you'll submit a test score to this college and not to that college. And that's where strategic guidance from you, Lauren, I think will come into play.
Excellent. Yeah, I do think testing at this point is still going to keep the greatest number of doors open, right?
Exactly.
So,
Exactly.
So all of that said, both the UC and the CSU are test blind, as you noted, for this year anyway. So what do we know about next year? You had to put your prognostication hat on.
It's still we're still in prognostication mode. Let me kind of break that into two parts. Let me tackle CSU first and then UC. CSU is test free right now. And they went that way voluntarily. They went that way back in the spring, and they officially are only test free for 1 year. But there is no reason to believe, and I have no suspicion that they'll ever go back. I do believe that we'll soon hear that they will renew that for another year, or perhaps just make it a permanent policy. But I think it's fairly safe to say that the CSUs will not be considering test scores ever again. The UCs are probably in that same camp, but for different reasons. Now, I could go into a long sort of discussion about the history of how they got there, but they are test free at the moment, but not voluntarily. Technically speaking, they are test free per a legal mandate. There was a preliminary injunction issued this fall in response to a lawsuit that was brought against the UCs that had a very narrow claim. And the narrow claim was, during a pandemic, students with disabilities are disproportionately disadvantaged or impacted by the reduction in testing capacity. So the reduction in testing venues and cancellations, it's hurting everybody, but it's hurting those with accommodations even more, because some of these reduced capacity venues can handle some students, but they can't handle as many students with disabilities. Thereby, a test optional policy is still unfair because it allows some students who had the option to test to submit scores if they want. So the judge agreed with this and said, you must go test free for a year during this public health crisis. There is a legal opportunity for them to go back to test optional for 1 year. I don't think it's going to happen, because prior to that legal ruling, the UCs had already committed to going test free in a couple of years. So they're going to sort of end up there one way or the other. So it's a long way of saying I really think you're on safe ground, sort of keeping testing out of the mix mentally, if you're talking specifically about in-state public schools and a handful of other, maybe 5 or 6 other private schools around the country that have also gone test-free. Caltech has gone test-free, University of San Diego, Reed College, Dickinson, Catholic. So there are maybe 5 or 6 others that have gone test-free. The rest of the landscape I would treat as test optional for now. And some of those 1-year concessions could go back to requiring test scores as soon as next year. We'll just have to see.
Yeah, and just to clarify, there's a question in the chat about test free. People are starting to use that phrasing now instead of test blind, as test blind can be a little ableist, but either way, it means the testing is literally not considered in the process. So the ACT and the SAT could be a different policy for something like AP test scores. And actually, Bruce, would you say something about subject tests at this point? Because I know they had been sort of declining in popularity generally, but some places are still saying, oh, you could send us a subject test. So what's your take on
sure. Both things are true. They have generally seen a decline in importance across the country over the last decade, because we're now in a world where no college requires subject tests as an eligibility criterion. So no one demands that you submit test scores. This was not true 10 years ago. However, as you said, there are maybe 3 or 4 dozen schools that go to the trouble to either recommend subject tests, or at least state that they will consider or give added value to strong subject test scores. The really interesting one, though, is the UC system. Because that lawsuit that I just referenced a minute ago, the plaintiffs did not include subject tests in their target. And they did so, I think that was a savvy move. It would have been legally risky to ask for subject test exemption as well, and it could have jeopardized their entire argument for the bigger fish, the SAT and ACT. But be that as it may, subject tests have been exempt from test free at UCs, which means they're still fair game, which means that they can receive your subject test scores, and subject tests are now effectively the only way you can submit a test score if you'd like to. So to the UCs. So now these are probably edge cases still. Certain campuses, certain majors, typically STEM. But if you dig into the recommendations of these highly competitive programs within a certain campus within the UCs, probably an engineering program, you'll find that they're recommending that you submit some subject test scores. So you're not allowed legally to send in your strong SAT score, but you certainly could take the math level 2, which is pre-calc and below, and knock it out of the park and say, well, I couldn't send you my SAT score, but I did score a 7 something on my math level 2. Why don't I share that with you?
Great, thank you for that. And I just want to touch on a couple of things that were in the chat. AP tests are usually not, touched by these policies. So if you're taking AP tests, you can send the scores in. You can not send the scores in, and I will help advise you on that next fall. I think it's always good to take the tests, and then we decide what we do with the scores afterwards. And then this question about what subjects are covered by subject tests. It can be all sorts of things. But right now it is, as Bruce just mentioned, often like engineering programs, STEM focused majors that might be interested in seeing a math subject test, a physics or chemistry subject test, but they're what the name describes. They're about a particular subject. And so our students will sometimes take subject tests in a class they've had an AP level in, and there is sometimes some corollary between those AP tests and the subject tests. Language as well, you can take a Hebrew exam if you're a native speaker or have reached a close to fluency level. If you've gone to AP Spanish, sometimes taking the Spanish subject test is possible. So again, it's another thing that we can discuss in our individual college advising meetings about whether that's a step it feels necessary for you to take. One follow-up on the UC situation, Bruce, do we know, is there a date by which the UC has told us about next year, or is that all just in flux because of the lawsuit?
Well, it's really not that, it's not so much in flux because of the lawsuit. The lawsuit only governs, the legal mandate only covers this current admission cycle.
Okay.
So once this admission cycle is over, the one that is dealing with current high school seniors, there's no longer a legal requirement to stay test-free. But I suspect the UCs and all the other test optionals and all the other schools that have non-permanent policies are going to be updating their policies this spring. But it's a little bit of a game of chicken because no college wants to be the first one to come out as the bad guy and say, hey, we're coming back to requiring test scores. It's not a good look, right? And yet a lot of them are probably saying, gosh, I wish someone else would do this so we could follow suit, right? But it's this balancing act of saying, well, if whatever we say as a college, we are signaling something to our potential students about what we value and what sort of risks we think they should be taking and what sort of priorities they should be making. And is it a good look for us to be encouraging students to go out and take tests while this pandemic lingers? Now, that's why I preach patience. I am generally optimistic about next year, and I think the class of 22 is going to have opportunities to take normal SATs and ACTs by the end of your testing window. I just don't know that it's going to happen early. I wouldn't put a lot of faith in February and March. I'd feel a little more confident about May and June. I'd feel even better about July and August. And I would remind myself that I still have September and October of next year. So you can prognosticate as well as I can about what effect the vaccines will have and where we will be as a society in 6 months or 9 months. But know that you've still got almost a full year to complete your testing, and that I would be probably exercising patience and treating this like it's like an athlete who's in a long rain delay. You don't really know when play is going to resume, but you do need to kind of be ready when it does. And we're all kind of in this waiting period, holding period. But I do think the class of 22, in retrospect, will look back and say, we had a slightly easier experience with testing than our predecessor class, the class of 21. This has been a tough year for them, for sure.
So one final question here, Bruce, is, do you have advice about test prep, knowing that we might not have folks testing in February and March as, some of the early folks out the gate might do. So what's your thought at this moment for juniors about moving towards preparing for a test date?
Well, test prep is just a subset. A test prep plan is just a subset of a testing plan, right? So I would first work on the testing plan and then derive a test prep plan back from there. And I would reiterate what I said a minute ago, which is I would first kind of mentally gear up for a slightly later than otherwise test date. So in a normal year, if I had a junior, my daughter's a freshman, and I've got a freshman in high school, freshman in college. So we're taking a couple of years off here in the middle without testing, but I'm certainly watching to see where this is going. If she were a junior this year, well, if she were a junior in a normal year, she'd probably be starting test prep now, November, December, and we'd be targeting a test in February, March, April. If it were this year, I'd probably be tapping the brakes a little bit and maybe starting prep after the new year if I haven't started already. I wouldn't worry. I wouldn't feel it. This does not feel late to me right now. It feels prudent to sort of hold steady for another month or so, and then maybe begin prep in January or February that is geared more toward those later spring dates. I think that's probably just a more conservative bet. But even then, you need to kind of roll with the punches and be resilient, because we could continue to face these case by case cancellations, postponements, and so forth.
Yeah, and there's a great question in the chat about what does it mean to test prep, and know that this is something we'll talk about in those individual college advising meetings, because it really, is a student by student scenario, and your practice test scores help give us some indication on that. Interest, what the list looks like. You may end up with a lot of test optional schools on your list to begin with, and so testing then, is in kind of a different category, but it can be everything from working in a $20 book, that's got some practice tests in it that you can do on your own time, to, meeting with a prep, tutor, someone from Compass or whatnot, once a week, and doing a lot of practice tests and all the rest. There's a whole range of options, and we'll talk about, what works best for both your student and your family. But as Bruce sort of indicated, it is a more short and focused effort that you are looking at an actual test date, right? And you're kind of backtracking from there. So whether it's 6 to 8 weeks, 8 to 10 weeks before you actually take the test, you don't want it to be this just like long-term thing that you burn out on, prepping over months and months and months before you actually have go time, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Prep is just, it's a catch-all term for any sort of intentional focus on the content and getting ready for it, getting familiar with the structure, the format, the content of the test. As Lauren said, you can do that lots of different ways, but it's that finite period of time of the, typically weeks and a couple of months maybe leading up to an official test date, where there's some time carved out to give some intentional focus on, what's to be expected on that test. It's studying for a test.
Great. And then there's a question here in the chat about the latest date. Typically, those October test dates are the last time it can really get factored into an early application. So we've had probably 90% of this year's senior class submit something early. Some of those are the binding kinds, and some are just you find out a decision early and they can sit on that until May 1st. But October is the last test date usually for early applications. And then November, December, there's still some opportunity there if you're applying to some schools' regular decision, which are usually January deadlines. So we've got a lot of runway. We've got, almost a year to sort of see what you can work with. So I'm going to pause there on Bruce, although we may come back to you if we have another question or two just at the end. But I do want to just hit a couple of wrap-up summary slides here as we get close to the end of the evening. Couple of JCHS specific points here. So again, we will be choosing between SAT or ACT, making a plan, and then I've got here try and aim to take it twice before your senior year really gets started, but we'll see. That, as Bruce had just mentioned, we may be on a slightly sort of longer timeline depending on when we can actually start testing into this winter and spring. But I would say at least trying to take it once before we get into senior year would be good. We want to make a plan to prepare for the test. Registering for something early, as I think someone noted in the chat, yes, seats will fill up. And especially if you observe Shabbat, those Sunday test dates can also fill up rather quickly. With the pandemic, they've actually been offering more Sunday testing seats, and you haven't necessarily had to have gone through all of the Jewish vetting hoops. There is some stuff you have to do in registering for a Sunday test date. They've made that a little bit more flexible during the pandemic, but typically Sunday seats can be a little bit more limited. And then if you receive testing accommodations currently at JCHS for your schoolwork, we do have to go through a process of applying for them with the SAT or the ACT. So you will work with Ms. Krieger on that. And as we get to a place where we're deciding on the test and thinking about a test date, let's loop Ms. Krieger in so that we know what types of materials she might need to submit to the test companies to make sure that you get any of the accommodations that you require. All right, so I just want to, before we totally wrap up here, I get questions from parents about how you can assist or engage in the admission process. Like what's your role here? As you know, we've been talking so much about what the students are going to do and what I'm going to do. So I do want to just mention a couple of things that are helpful. Helping me, partnering with me on managing the timeline with students. And you'll get lots of sort of reminders and emails and things from me about what's coming up. But there also is sort of an overview of this whole process in the College Advising Handbook. On the first couple of pages, there's a timeline for each year of high school. So keeping an eye on that, helping, all of us sort of stay on track will be great. If we ever get to go on a college campus again in person, you can be very useful in terms of scheduling some of those visits and helping in terms of, especially if we're going to travel to go see a college campus, to help your child sort of manage what that's going to look like. Helping to register students for testing. There are going to be a lot of moments in this process where your credit card is going to be required, and this is typically the first one of them. So helping to get your student ready to go with taking a test. Investigating funding options for college. Clearly, colleges view the parents as being the primary source of payment for college tuition. So getting into the funding conversation sooner rather than later. I have an email queued up to go out to you all in a couple of days about some JCHS workshops that are going to be happening in January around financing a college education. So that's the first opportunity to do a little bit of work. I'm also going to hold 2 at JCHS this winter, or at, online here for JCHS, depending on when we can get back in the building. But one just quick half an hour overview on financial aid for those who want like the top level and to be able to just think about the big picture for a minute. And then one in March that's going to be a lot more detailed and really dig into the FAFSA and the CSS profile. So keep an eye out for all of those. Really understanding the funding issue is going to be important for you. I would ask you to fact check where you get your admission advice from. There's a lot of people that frankly want to make money off of your stress and anxiety around this process. So if you hear something that feels alarming or worrying or whatnot, just check in with me, and I am happy to serve as the barometer for what may be of real concern and what is just some of the hype or the media stuff out there to sell newspapers and magazines. And then I would really encourage parents to please stay behind the white line. And what is the white line? Well, I'm so glad you asked. White line violations include talking about college all the time. I promise you, you've got potentially a year and a half left with your child in your house if we ever get out of this pandemic. And so in order for everyone's lives to be easier, I would really encourage you now to think about if there's like a time that you want to check in about college, like once a week or once every other week, whether that's Sunday nights or Thursday nights or something, but give it a spot in the schedule that will make your child perhaps calm down a little bit, that it's going to be the dinner topic every night, and also give you peace of mind that there is a time to talk about it, right? So I would think about ways that you can box in the conversation. Please don't contact colleges on your child's behalf, unless it is to like set up that campus tour. But parents emailing colleges to pretend to be their kids, like that happens. And it's weird, and don't do that. This is a moment for kids to start, flexing their independence and taking charge of the process. So let them do that. If you get to go on a campus tour, don't be more memorable than your child. So let them take the lead on a lot of these conversations and questions and all the rest. And it should go without saying, but this is a conversation I have to have maybe every other year. Please don't write, type, or submit an application on behalf of your child. This is a rite of passage that they need to go through and that they should own. So let them own it. Okay, so with that, I'm gonna just remind us, this is the to-do list of what's to come. Questionnaires, advising appointments. It's great over the next few weeks for kids to be considering those 5 I's, to do some U Science games. We're going to talk about your testing plan. You're going to spend the next couple of months researching colleges. And amongst all this, we're going to attempt to enjoy junior year as well. Okay. It's 7:55 and there are 9 questions in the chat. I'm going to look at these really quickly and just see if there's anything I should. Yes, please don't hover, badger, and smother. That would be amazing. Question about the PSAT in January. Yeah, let me just touch on that for a second. As you all know, we just got another ESB update about when we might be able to go back to Ellis Street. If we go back that week in January, we would be offering, in theory, the real PSAT that week. I think that for the vast majority of the class, it's not necessary for you to go through the process of taking that PSAT. There are a handful of you, and I've just done a cursory glance over your practice test results. There are a handful of you that I think are scoring within the potential range of National Merit semifinalist status. That would be the real reason to take the official PSAT. And I will let you know who you are about whether that is something you want to think about. But for most of you, you've done the practice. I don't see a reason to take another day to sit through the test and do it again. But again, we're not 100% sure we're going to be able to offer it, so I will keep you posted. Let's see if there's any other questions. Yes, The College Conversation was the book I held up earlier. This is Jack Steinberg, who's a friend of mine, he's great, and Eric Furta, who's the Dean of Admission at Penn. Just came out this fall. Very useful stuff about the college search. And yes, the FIS guide is also extremely helpful. Any other questions that folks want to put in the chat before we wrap up here for either me or for Bruce? So appreciate your engagement. I know we spend all day on Zoom. All right, we got a couple of thank you.
I'll just quickly add, Lauren, that I think you and I are going to put together a few links that we'll get out to people, but included on that list will be a number of testing related research pages that we just maintain already for you. So rather than you reinventing the wheel by trying to look up thousands of schools, we've got a lot of this data kind of consolidated, and we keep it up to date as soon as news breaks. So we'll get those out to you probably tomorrow, right, Lauren?
Yeah, I will push out as soon as Mr. McDonald, who's also, if you've noticed, delightfully with us this evening as well, will be making this a YouTube video. And so we'll try and send out all of the follow-up stuff together. And I will just note 2 follow-up things. One, keeping an eye on Compass is always great. I am watching their monthly webinars on like the state of college testing. And they're open, they're really for families and kids, but college counselors utilize them as well. They are my go-to to find out what's happening right now and to get my head around it. And I'm also going to be putting on the calendar a couple of like parent coffees that might be on Zoom in the morning that we could do periodically, just because there is stuff changing. And I know this is complicated and we can't just pass each other in the hall at school as you drop off your child's lunch or whatnot to ask questions. So to just have some open Q&A time for us to check in periodically, I think will just help keep the communication lines open. All right, and I'm seeing a lot of thank yous, and we're going to end it there. If folks have other specific questions, want to email me about them, that would be great. Otherwise, you're going to get your questionnaires in your email box tomorrow, and we'll start launching all of these individual conversations. But want to thank everyone for being here. I want to thank Bruce in particular for your time. I know you had a double header here this evening, as did Mr. McDonald with an admission meeting earlier too. So really good folks in the community. Thank you all. Have a good evening.